I found Nano's killing tools in the same box as my first communion photos. The irony wasn't lost on me, even through the lorazepam fog. There I was at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning in my little white suit, clutching a rosary blessed by Pope John Paul II himself. Right underneath, wrapped in the same tissue paper Nana used for Christmas ornaments, lay a consecrated silver dagger, a vial of what looked like mercury, and a leather-bound journal that smelled like incense and old blood. I should explain. My name is Matteo Albani, and 3 weeks ago I inherited my grandfather's Vatican apartment along with everything he couldn't take to his grave, which, as it turns out, was considerably more than anyone expected. Nana had died first, peacefully in her sleep, rosary still clutched in arthritic fingers. The funeral was small but proper. Latin Mass at Sant'Andrea del Frat, burial in Campo Verano beside the other Vatican families. Nano followed 6 days later. Heart attack, the doctors said, but I remember his last words in the hospital. Matteo, Illinois lista di visir completata. The list must be completed. At the time, I thought it was delirium. Giovanni Albani had worked as a custodian in the Apostolic Palace for 43 years. What list could a man who mopped floors possibly leave unfinished? I was completing my doctoral dissertation on medieval Vatican bureaucracy, specifically the administrative evolution of the Sacred Rota tribunal system from 1870 to 1950. Dry stuff, but it paid for my cramped studio near San Giovanni and kept me in the Vatican secret archives where I belonged. 3 generations of Albanese had served the church, and I intended to serve through scholarship rather than brooms and blessed water. The irony, of course, is that I'd been researching Vatican administrative structures for 3 years and never once encountered the term Eliminator Apostolico in any document. If such a division existed, it left no paper trail in the official records, which should have been my first clue. The apartment on Via della Conciliazione came as a shock. I'd visited maybe twice as a child. Nana always preferred hosting at our family home in Frascati. But stepping into those rooms after the funeral felt like entering a museum of my family's devotion. Every wall bore religious imagery, Sacred Heart icons, faded photographs of papal audiences, a crucifix from each pope Nano had served under. The man had collected blessed medals like some people collect stamps. It was beautiful, in a suffocating sort of way. The kind of faith that leaves no room for doubt or questions. The kind I'd been running from since seminary. I started packing methodically, books first, then the obviously valuable items. The church would expect the apartment returned promptly. Vatican housing waiting lists stretched for years. But when I moved the heavy armoire in Nano's bedroom, looking for anything valuable tucked behind it, I heard something rattle inside the wall. The panel was barely visible, painted to match the faded yellow wallpaper. It took 20 minutes with a kitchen knife to pry it open, and when I did, the small hidden compartment exhaled air that tasted like, how do I describe it? Like the Sistine Chapel at 4 a.m., when the tourists are gone, and something ancient breathes in the darkness. The wooden box inside was maybe the size of a missile, worn smooth by handling. No lock, just a simple brass clasp. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The lorazepam only does so much, and that's when I saw them together. My first communion photo, and beneath it, implements that belonged in a horror film, not a custodian's hidden shrine. The dagger's blade caught the afternoon light streaming through the apartment's windows. Pure silver, definitely, with Latin inscriptions running along the fuller. In nomine patris, et filii, et spiritus sancti. But there were other markings too, symbols I didn't recognize from any theology text. The handle was wrapped in what looked like leather, though it felt wrong under my fingers, too warm, too responsive. The vial puzzled me more. Not mercury, I realized after tilting it. The liquid moved too slowly, too deliberately, like it was alive. A small label in Nano's careful handwriting read, Aqua Benedetta Speciale, solo per emergens. Special blessed water, for emergencies only. But the journal, Dio mio, the journal. It was bound in dark leather, maybe calfskin, with pages that seemed far older than Nano's lifetime. The first entry was dated September 15th, 1962, 2 weeks after I was born, as it happens. The handwriting was definitely his, that careful script I remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists. Today, Cardinal Montini approved my transfer to the Eliminator Apostolico division. 47 years old, and finally I serve God's true purpose. The training begins tomorrow. May the Blessed Virgin guide my hand in the work ahead. Eliminatore Apostolico. Apostolic Eliminator. I stared at those words until they burned into my retinas. In all my research into Vatican administrative history, I'd never encountered such a division. And I'd spent 3 years cataloging every department, subcommittee, and clerical position from 1870 forward. I flipped through more pages, my academic mind trying to process what I was reading. October 3rd, 1962. First assignment completed successfully. The thing wearing Cardinal Tisserant's face put up more resistance than expected, but the blessed silver held true. Real Tisserant found in basement of Castel Gandolfo, catatonic but alive. Cover story, exhaustion from council preparations. None must know how close we came to having an impostor influence the Second Vatican Council. November 18th, 1963, Sister Bernadetta's situation resolved. Used the special blessed water rather than silver. She was still partially human when I found her. The screaming, Madonna mia, I can still hear it, but better screaming than what she was becoming. The other nuns believe she died of tuberculosis. Sometimes the kindest lie is the truest mercy. June 2nd, 1972, new list arrived via Cardinal Villat's private secretary. 7 names this time, each one worse than the last. I pray Matteo never knows what his nonno does in the service of Christ's church. The pages blurred as my eyes filled with tears. Not grief, something else. Horror, maybe. Or recognition of something I'd spent 28 years not seeing. I turned to the back of the journal, looking for some explanation, some context that would make this all sensible. Instead, I found a loose sheet of paper, folded twice, with my name written on the outside in Nonno's shaking final handwriting. Matteo, if you are reading this, then the Lord has called me home and left you to carry our family's burden. I had hoped, I had prayed that this cup might pass from our house. But the work is not finished, and blood calls to blood in ways the Church does not speak of openly. 41 years I have served as Eliminator Apostolico. 41 years of protecting the Church from things that were the faces of the faithful, but served darker masters. Your father knew. It killed him, not the car accident, but the knowing. Some souls cannot bear the weight of what we must do. The list on the final page contains 7 names. 6 I could not complete before my heart gave out. 1 I dared not attempt. Each name has its method, its rules. Follow them exactly, or join the long roll of Albanese who died serving God's hidden will. The Church needs guardians, figlio mio. Not just of faith, but of the faithful themselves. You have the education I never had, the access to places I could only clean. Perhaps you can succeed where I failed. With love and prayers for your soul. Giovanni Albani, Eliminator Apostolico, Apostolic Palace, 1962 to 2003. P.S. The apartment is yours by right of blood, not papal generosity. Our family has paid for it in ways the Vatican prefers not to remember. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I turned to the final page. There, in Nonno's careful script, 7 names were listed in black ink. Next to each name, a method. Next to each method, a date, most crossed out in red ink, marking completion. But 3 names remained untouched by red, including one that made my blood freeze. 7. Giovanni Albani. When all others are crossed out, this one awakens. That was yesterday. Since then, I haven't left the apartment. I've been sitting here with Nonno's journal, trying to understand. Trying to decide if my grandfather was a holy warrior or a madman. Trying to figure out why my hands fit the silver dagger's grip like it was made for them. The worst part? I keep looking at those 6 uncompleted names, and something in my chest, something I don't want to acknowledge, whispers that I already know where to find them. God help me, I think I want to complete the list. But first, I need to understand what my family has really been doing in the Vatican's shadow for 41 years. And why, despite every rational thought in my head, part of me already knows I'm going to pick up that dagger and finish what Nonno started. After all, blood calls to blood. And the Church, it seems, has been calling to the Albanese for longer than any of us dared to imagine. The Vatican's secret archives smell like centuries of secrets wrapped in leather and dust. I'd spent 3 years in those climate-controlled chambers, but walking through the bronze doors that Monday morning felt different. Like entering a crime scene where I was both investigator and suspect. My research request was approved within hours, unusual speed for Vatican bureaucracy. Dr. Ricci, the archive supervisor, barely glanced at my application for Administrative Personnel Records, 1960 to 2005. He just stamped it and waved me toward Section K, where the personnel files lived in endless beige boxes. Matteo, you look terrible, he said, not unkindly. Perhaps some time away from your dissertation? I wanted to laugh. Away from my dissertation on medieval bureaucracy, toward modern supernatural enforcement? Just family research, dottore. Trying to understand Nano's service record. Ah, si. Giovanni was a good man. Quiet. Never caused problems. Ricci's eyes lingered on my face. Very dedicated to his work. The way he said dedicated made my skin crawl. Like he knew something I was only beginning to discover. Section K was usually empty. Most researchers worked with older documents. But that morning I found another scholar already there. A thin woman with prematurely gray hair hunched over a stack of files. She looked up when I entered, and her face went pale. You're in Albany, she said. Not a question. Matteo. And you are? Dr. Elena Colonna. I was. I knew your grandfather. She closed the file she'd been reading, but not before I caught a glimpse of the cover. Eliminator Apostolico, Personnel Medical Records. My mouth went dry. You knew about his real work. She looked around the empty room, then leaned closer. Giovanni saved my life in 1987. I was a medical student then, doing an internship at the Vatican clinic. Something had gotten into the pediatric ward. Something that looked like one of the nuns, but... She shuddered. Children were disappearing. Not kidnapped, consumed. Eaten from the inside out while they slept. I felt the lorazepam wearing off, anxiety crawling up my spine like cold fingers. What did he do? He came to me first. Asked if I'd noticed anything unusual about Sister Caterina Moretti, the new nun who'd transferred from Sicily. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. I had noticed. She never ate, never slept, and whenever she worked a shift, children developed these marks. Like bite wounds, but from the inside. Sister Caterina Moretti. The second name on Nano's list, marked with a red cross. Completed. Giovanni told me to take a week's leave. When I came back, Sister Caterina had returned to Sicily for family reasons. The children recovered, but I knew. Elena's hands were shaking now. I knew he'd killed something wearing a nun's face to save those children. How did you know about the Eliminator division? I didn't, not officially. But after that night, Giovanni would come to the clinic sometimes. Always after incidents. Always with injuries that couldn't be explained through normal channels. She opened her bag and pulled out a thick medical file. Cuts from silver weapons. Burns from blessed substances. Psychological trauma consistent with, well, with encountering things that shouldn't exist. I stared at the file. My grandfather's name was written across the tab in Elena's careful handwriting. You kept records. Someone had to. The Vatican has ways of making inconvenient truths disappear, but medical evidence is harder to erase. She hesitated, then pushed the file toward me. Giovanni mentioned you once. Said you were studying Vatican history. He was proud of you, but also worried. Worried about what? That you'd inherited more than his apartment. The medical file made for grim reading. 41 years of unexplained injuries, all treated off the books by Dr. Colonna. Lacerations from blessed silver contact in 1963. Second-degree burns from consecrated mercury exposure in 1971. Psychological evaluation notes describing nightmares, recurring visions of entities wearing familiar faces, and what Elena delicately termed occupational stress disorder. But it was the final entry that stopped my breath. March 15, 2003. Patient presents with chest pains, shortness of breath, and acute anxiety. Reports recurring dreams of the seventh name awakening. Claims family bloodline cursed to serve until the list completes itself. Recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation, but patient refuses. Note, patient's grandson, Matteo Albani, enrolled in Vatican history program. Patient fears generational transfer of duties. Prescribed mild sedatives, but prognosis poor given patient's conviction that duties cannot be abandoned. He knew, I whispered. He knew this would pass to me. Elena nodded grimly. The last time I saw him, a week before he died, he asked me to watch for you. Said if you came looking for answers about his work, I should help you understand what you'd inherited. And what exactly have I inherited? She closed the medical file and looked directly into my eyes. A war that's been going on for centuries. Between the church and things that want to wear the church like a mask. Your grandfather wasn't a custodian, Matteo. He was a soldier. And now I'm being drafted. The question is whether you'll serve willingly or be compelled. Before I could ask what she meant by compelled, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside Section K. Elena immediately began shuffling papers, assuming the posture of someone absorbed in innocent research. But when the door opened, we both froze. The man who entered wore the black cassock of a Vatican priest, but something about him felt wrong. Too tall, maybe, or his smile was too wide. His eyes focused on me immediately, ignoring Elena entirely. Dottore Albani, I am Father Giuliano Rossini, Vatican Diplomatic Corps. I understand you've been researching your grandfather's service record. The third name on the list, unmarked by red ink. My throat felt like sandpaper. Father Rossini. Yes, just family curiosity. Of course, family is so important. His smile never wavered, but his eyes were completely cold. I worked with Giovanni occasionally. Such a dedicated man. Tell me, did he leave you any personal effects? Items of sentimental value? Elena's warning echoed in my head, something that wants to wear the church like a mask. Looking at Father Rossini's too perfect clerical appearance, I understood what she meant. Just some photographs, I lied. Religious medals. The usual things. Nothing else? No journals, perhaps? Old books. Your grandfather was quite thorough in his documentation. The way he emphasized thorough made it clear he knew exactly what documentation I'd found. But how could he know about Nano's journal unless he was the reason Nano couldn't complete the list? I'm afraid not, Father. If you'll excuse me, I should return to my research. Of course. But Matteo, may I call you Matteo? If you do find anything unusual among Giovanni's belongings, please contact me immediately. Some family legacies are too dangerous to handle alone. He placed a business card on the table between us. The Vatican seal looked official, but when I glanced at it, the Latin inscription seemed to writhe and shift under my eyes. I blinked hard, and it was normal again. After Father Rossini left, Elena grabbed my arm. That wasn't human. What do you mean? His shadow. Look at the floor where he was standing. The afternoon light from Section K's windows threw long shadows across the marble floor. But where Father Rossini had stood, the shadow remained, dark and unnaturally thick, shaped like a man but too large, with fingers that extended into claws. As we watched, the shadow began to fade, but slowly, like ink dissolving in water. Dio mio, I whispered. How long has he been impersonating a priest? According to Vatican records, Father Rossini has served in the diplomatic corps for 8 years. But Giovanni's journal might tell you when the real Father Rossini died. I thought about Nano's entry mentioning the thing wearing Cardinal Tisserant's face. How many Vatican officials were really something else? How deep did this infection go? Elena gathered her files quickly, glancing nervously at the door. Matteo, you need to understand something. Your grandfather didn't just kill monsters. He killed things that had already killed and replaced people. Sometimes priests. Sometimes nuns. Sometimes cardinals. I finished, remembering the journal entry about Cardinal Tisserant. The church is under siege from within. Has been for decades, maybe centuries. The Eliminator division exists because normal church authorities can't tell the difference between the real clergy and the substitutes. Then why wasn't it documented? Why no official records? Because some of the church hierarchy are compromised. Not possessed, willing collaborators. They protect the imposters in exchange for power or promises. Elena's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Your grandfather suspected Cardinal Agnelli was one of them. That's why he couldn't complete that name on the list. Cardinal Francesco Agnelli. The first name on Nano's list unmarked. Elena, what happens if the list isn't completed? According to Giovanni's fears, the 7th name awakens. Your grandfather's own name on the list wasn't a target, it was a failsafe. If he couldn't complete his duties, the curse would claim him and pass to the next generation. She met my eyes with grim certainty. To you. That evening, I sat in Nano's apartment with his journal open to the list of names. 6 entries, 3 still unmarked. Cardinal Francesco Agnelli, never approached during Laude's prayer. Sister Caterina Moretti, salt circles only, never blessed water, completed. Father Giuliano Rossini, shoots blessed silver, aim for the heart. The Camerlengo's secretary, real name unknown, changes faces. Archbishop Leone Bianchi, only appears during conclave years, completed. Brother Marcello Vitali, speaks only in dead languages, never answer, completed. Giovanni Albani, when all others are crossed out, this one awakens. 3 names remaining. And based on my encounter with Father Rossini, at least one of them knew I existed and was watching me. I picked up the consecrated silver dagger, feeling how perfectly it fit my hand. The metal was warm to the touch, almost eager. In the lamplight, I could see my reflection in the blade, but behind my own face, I thought I saw Nano's eyes, sad and knowing. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, stuffier, like the walls were closing in, or like something was breathing just outside the windows, waiting for me to make a choice. I thought about Elena's words, willingly or be compelled. Looking at Father Rossini's business card on the table, I realized the choice might already be made. Whatever was wearing his face knew about the list, knew about my family's role, and if I didn't act soon, it would act first. I closed the journal and picked up my phone. Elena had given me her number, along with a promise to help however she could. Because, as she'd put it, some wars choose their soldiers. Tomorrow, I would begin to hunt. Not because I wanted to, but because 41 years of family service had led to this moment, this apartment, this terrible inheritance. Blood calls to blood, and somewhere in the Vatican's shadowed halls, things wearing stolen faces were calling back. The blessed silver dagger felt heavier each day I carried it. 3 weeks had passed since my encounter with the thing wearing Father Rossini's face, and I'd made no progress toward completing Nano's list. Every time I approached Cardinal Agnelli's offices during his morning prayers, my nerve failed. Every time I researched the Camerlengo's secretary, the records led nowhere. No photographs, no consistent descriptions, just a title that seemed to exist in bureaucratic limbo. But they were watching me. I felt eyes on my back walking through St. Peter's Square, caught glimpses of black cassocks that disappeared too quickly around corners. Found my apartment door unlocked twice, though nothing was disturbed. Elena met me at Cafe San Eustachio, a few blocks from the Vatican. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes that matched my own. "You can't keep carrying those weapons around Vatican City," she said without preamble. "Security has noticed. Captain Farnese asked me yesterday if I knew why a graduate student needed special religious artifacts for his research." I stirred my espresso, watching the crema swirl. "Captain Alessandro Farnese? Swiss Guard commander?" "The same. And before you ask, yes, I checked. He's been in that position for 6 years, since his predecessor died in a climbing accident in the Alps." Elena's voice carried the weight of someone who'd learned to question every official story. "But his personnel file has gaps. Medical records from before 2018 are missing. Another name to worry about. Elena, I need to know something. When Nano eliminated these things, what happened to the bodies?" "Bodies?" She looked confused. "Matteo, these entities don't leave bodies. When Giovanni destroyed the thing wearing Sister Caterina's face, there was just absence. Like a person-shaped hole in reality that slowly filled itself back in. Then how do we know they're really gone?" Elena went very still. "What do you mean? I mean, what if crossing names off the list doesn't eliminate them? What if it does something else?" The thought had been growing in my mind like a tumor. Nano's journal mentions binding rituals, containment protocols. What if the Eliminator doesn't kill these things? What if he captures them? Before Elena could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Your grandfather's confessor would like to speak with you. Church of Sant'Andrea della Valle, 3 p.m. Come alone. Father Benedetto Orsini." I showed Elena the message. Her face went pale. "Matteo, your grandfather never mentioned a confessor named Orsini. You think it's a trap?" "I think everything is a trap now." She gathered her bag quickly. "But if there's a chance Father Orsini has answers about your grandfather's real work, you think I should go? I think you're going whether I recommend it or not. But take this." She pressed a small glass vial into my hand. "Holy water from Lourdes, blessed by Pope Francis himself. If something's not human, this will reveal it." The Church of Sant'Andrea della Valle sat in the heart of Rome, its Baroque facade darkened by centuries of urban grime. I arrived early, trying to identify possible escape routes and anyone who might be watching. The church was nearly empty, just a handful of elderly women praying the rosary and a single priest kneeling before the altar. The priest looked up as I approached. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of intense eyes that suggested either sanctity or madness. "Matteo Albani, you look like your grandfather, especially around the eyes." He stood, brushing dust from his cassock. "I am Father Benedetto Orsini. Thank you for coming. You said you were Nano's confessor?" "For the last 15 years of his life, yes. Though confessor implies he believed he had committed sins. Giovanni understood his work differently." Father Orsini walked toward a side chapel dedicated to Saint Michael the Archangel. He saw himself as a soldier in a war most people refuse to acknowledge exists. I followed him, my hand instinctively moving toward the concealed dagger. What kind of war? The kind where the enemy wears familiar faces and speaks with trusted voices. Where the battlefield is human souls and the weapons are faith and doubt. He stopped before St. Michael's statue, the archangel crushing a demon beneath his feet. Your grandfather told me about the list. 7 names that represent the greatest threats to the church's spiritual integrity. He told you about the names? He told me about his failure to complete them. Father Orsini's voice carried genuine grief. Giovanni died believing he had condemned you to inherit his burden. But what if I told you his understanding was incomplete? What do you mean? The list isn't an execution order, Matteo. It's a recruitment contract. My blood went cold. What? Each name on that list represents an entity that was bound to serve the church through the eliminator ritual. Not destroyed, enslaved. Your grandfather spent 41 years not killing monsters, but press-ganging them into Vatican service. The church seemed to grow darker around us, shadows lengthening despite the afternoon light. That's impossible. Elena said these things disappeared when Nano eliminated them. They disappeared from their previous roles, yes. But where do you think the church gets its supernatural enforcement capabilities? How do you think the Vatican has maintained power for 2 millennia while surrounded by entities that could destroy it? Father Orsini's smile was sad and knowing. By turning the enemy into unwilling servants. I thought about the medical records Elena had shown me. Nano's injuries from blessed silver and consecrated mercury. The weapons weren't for killing them. They were for, what? Performing the binding rituals? Consecrated silver burns entities but doesn't destroy them. It marks them, claims them. Each successful elimination in Giovanni's journal represents another supernatural being bound to Vatican service. Father Orsini gestured toward the statue of Saint Michael. Even the angels serve under compulsion, according to some interpretations. So Sister Caterina is still alive, still serving the church, but no longer free to choose. The thing that replaced Father Rossini is similarly bound, though it retains enough autonomy to be dangerous. His expression grew grim. Cardinal Agnelli, however, presents a different problem. Because he's not possessed or replaced. He's human. Worse, he's a willing collaborator. Someone who made a deal with entities for power and influence. The blessed silver won't work on him because his corruption is voluntary. Father Orsini reached into his cassock and withdrew an ornate key. But your grandfather left specific instructions for handling Cardinal Agnelli. The key was heavy, made of some dark metal that felt warm to the touch. Engraved along its length was a single word in Latin, libertas. What does it unlock? The real question is what it releases. Father Orsini's eyes met mine, and I saw something there that made my stomach clench. Giovanni discovered that Cardinal Agnelli has been feeding Vatican secrets to hostile entities for over a decade. Financial information, security protocols, the names and locations of faithful clergy who might resist infiltration. You're saying Agnelli is a traitor. I'm saying Agnelli is worse than a traitor. He's a heretic who has sold the church's spiritual authority to buy temporal power. Father Orsini gripped my shoulder. That key opens his private safe in the Vatican Bank. Inside, you'll find evidence of his collaboration and something else, a binding contract written in blood and signed by things that shouldn't be able to sign human documents. What kind of contract? The kind that makes Cardinal Agnelli legally the property of entities that want to use the Vatican's global influence for their own purposes. Your grandfather realized that simply killing Agnelli wouldn't solve the problem. The entities would just find another collaborator. His grip tightened. But if you use that key during Cardinal Agnelli's morning prayers, when his spiritual defenses are strongest, you can invoke the contract's termination clause. Which does what exactly? It transfers ownership of Cardinal Agnelli's soul from the entities back to God. Which means he dies, I finished. During prayer. Looking like a heart attack or stroke. Looking like divine judgment. I stared at the key, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. Nano couldn't do it. That's why Cardinal Agnelli's name was never crossed off. Giovanni couldn't bring himself to murder a human being, even a corrupted one. He could bind supernatural entities that felt like justice. But executing a man during prayer felt too much like playing God. Father Orsini released my shoulder. The question is whether you're stronger than your grandfather, or whether you'll pass this burden to your own children. I don't have children. Yet. The implication hung between us like incense smoke. I was 28 years old, unmarried, focused on my academic career. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd always assumed I'd have a family eventually. The idea that this curse might continue through my bloodline made my hands shake. There's something else, Father Orsini continued. The seventh name on the list, your grandfather's name, isn't meant to be crossed off by the current eliminator. It's meant to be crossed off by the next generation, after the current one dies in service. You're saying this job is designed to kill whoever does it? I'm saying the eliminator position exists to bind not just supernatural entities, but the human agents who serve as instruments of binding. Your grandfather lived longer than most because he refused to complete Cardinal Agnelli's elimination. But the curse doesn't wait forever. As if summoned by his words, a shadow moved in the church's nave. I turned to see a figure in Swiss Guard uniform approaching. Captain Alessandro Farnese, his dress uniform pristine, his ceremonial halberd gleaming. "Dr. Albany," he called out, his voice echoing off the Baroque walls. "I'm afraid you'll need to come with me." Father Orsini stepped protectively in front of me. "Captain, this is a private religious consultation." "My apologies, Father, but the young man is wanted for questioning regarding some missing artifacts from Vatican property." Captain Farnese's smile was polite and completely inhuman. "I'm sure you understand the church's position on theft." I felt the blessed silver dagger against my ribs and Elena's vial of holy water in my pocket. Two weapons that might work against supernatural entities, useless against a Swiss guard who might be perfectly human and just following orders. "What artifacts?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Items that belonged to the late Giovanni Albani. Items that should have been returned to church custody upon his death." The captain's grip on his halberd shifted slightly, and I noticed his fingers were too long, the knuckles too prominent. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding." Father Orsini whispered urgently, "The holy water. Now." I pulled out Elena's vial and uncorked it, flinging the contents toward Captain Farnese. The blessed water struck his face and uniform, and for a moment nothing happened. Then his skin began to bubble and smoke where the water had touched. But he didn't scream. Instead, he laughed. "Oh, clever boy. But you see, I'm not possessed or replaced." The captain's face was melting and reforming, revealing something angular and wrong underneath. "I'm something much older. Something that signed treaties with the Vatican long before your grandfather was born." "Run," Father Orsini said. Now, I ran. Behind me, I heard Captain Farnese's voice change, deepening into something that shouldn't come from a human throat. "Giovanni's grandson cannot leave Rome, Father. The contract is specific. 7 names, 7 bindings, 7 generations of service. The boy has inherited more than weapons and journals." I burst through the church doors into afternoon sunlight, but the brightness felt thin and unconvincing. People walked past on the Via dei Cappuccini, as if nothing supernatural was occurring 20 feet away. As if the boundaries between the Vatican's hidden war and the normal world were absolute. My phone was buzzing with messages. 3 from Elena, 2 from unknown numbers, and 1 from Dr. Ricci at the archives. "Matteo, please report to Section K immediately. We've discovered additional materials related to your grandfather's service record." Another trap, probably, but as I stood in the Roman sunlight, clutching the dark metal key that could end Cardinal Agnelli's life, I realized that every choice now led deeper into the maze my grandfather had built around our family. The key felt heavier in my hand, like a weapon, like a responsibility, like a chain I could either wear willingly or have locked around my neck by things with too long fingers and treaty rights stretching back centuries. Father Orsini emerged from the church, breathing hard. "Matteo, listen to me. You have perhaps 6 hours before they realize you won't cooperate voluntarily. 6 hours to either complete the list or find another way to break the contract." "What other way?" "Your grandfather spent years researching alternatives. There might be something in his papers, something you haven't found yet." His eyes were bright with desperate hope. "The church survived for 2,000 years before the Eliminator division existed. There has to be another way to maintain the spiritual balance. And if there isn't..." Father Orsini looked back toward the church, where Captain Farnese presumably waited with inhuman patience. "Then you become what your grandfather refused to become. An executioner who kills humans as well as monsters. A man who murders during prayer and calls it divine justice. Or you become the 7th name on someone else's list." As I walked away from the Church of Sant'Andrea della Valle, the key burning like a coal in my pocket, I understood why Nano had died with his work incomplete. Some choices don't offer right answers, only different ways to be damned. But I also understood something else. I was not my grandfather. I had advantages he'd never possessed: Elena's medical knowledge, Father Orsini's theological insights, and most importantly, the knowledge that the system itself was corrupt. Maybe the war wasn't between the church and supernatural entities. Maybe it was between those who profited from the current system and those who sought to expose it. Maybe it was time to stop playing by the Vatican's rules entirely. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from Father Rossini. The list must be completed, Giovanni's grandson, or the consequences will extend far beyond your family. I deleted the message and kept walking, the blessed silver dagger solid against my ribs, the dark key warm in my hand, and my grandfather's voice echoing in my memory. Some duties cannot be abandoned. Perhaps not, but they could be transformed. The afternoon shadows were lengthening, and I had work to do. The Vatican Bank's sub-basement felt like a tomb at 4:47 a.m. I'd been hiding in a maintenance closet for 3 hours, waiting for Cardinal Agnelli's morning prayers to begin in his private chapel. The key Father Orsini had given me sat heavy in my palm, its dark metal warm as flesh. Libertas. Freedom. But freedom for whom? Elena's research had confirmed what Father Orsini suspected. Cardinal Agnelli arrived at his private chapel every morning at 5 a.m. for an hour of solitary prayer before the banking offices opened. His security detail waited outside during these sessions, respecting the cardinal's spiritual privacy. It was the only time he was truly alone, the only time he was vulnerable. My hands shook as I checked Nano's journal one final time, squinting at his cramped handwriting in the maintenance closet's dim light. The entry about Cardinal Agnelli was different from the others, longer, more desperate, full of crossed-out words and smudged ink. November 17th, 1987. Cannot proceed with Agnelli elimination. Contract implications too severe. The binding would not hold. His corruption is voluntary, chosen. The key opens more than a safe. It opens a door that should remain closed. God forgive me, I cannot be the instrument of what comes after. December 23rd, 1987. Dreamed again of the thing that wears Agnelli's face during Easter, Massachusetts. In the dream, it had my grandson's eyes. The curse adapts. The curse learns. The curse finds new ways to perpetuate itself. January 3rd, 1988. Father Orsini says I am a coward. Perhaps. But some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Better that Matteo inherit my failure than my success. I closed the journal, understanding flooding through me like ice water. Nano hadn't failed to eliminate Cardinal Agnelli. He'd refused to. Because he'd discovered that using the key wouldn't free the cardinal's soul for divine judgment. It would free something else entirely. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made me freeze. Through the keyhole, I watched Cardinal Agnelli approach his private chapel, his morning routine unchanged after decades. He looked exactly as I remembered from official Vatican photographs, silver-haired, dignified, moving with the careful grace of a man in his 80s who refused to acknowledge his age. But there was something wrong with his shadow. It moved independently, lagging behind by half a second, and occasionally it had too many arms. The chapel door closed behind him with a soft click. Through the thin walls, I heard him begin the liturgy of the hours in Latin, his voice steady and practiced. It sounded like genuine prayer, not the performance of a man who'd sold his soul to hostile entities. That was the most terrifying part. Cardinal Agnelli still believed he was serving God. I waited until I heard him transition into personal prayer, his voice becoming softer, more intimate. Then I slipped from the maintenance closet and approached his private safe, built into the chapel wall behind a Renaissance painting of St. Matthew. The key slid into the lock like it belonged there, turning with oiled precision. Inside the safe, I found exactly what Father Orsini had promised: documents, photographs, and something that made my skin crawl. A contract written in dark red ink on parchment that looked far older than the 40 years Cardinal Agnelli had served the Vatican. The text was in Latin, but the signatures at the bottom were in scripts I couldn't read, forming shapes that hurt to look at directly. But it wasn't just a contract. It was a feeding schedule. Names, dates, and locations of faithful Catholics around the world. Pilgrims visiting holy sites, clergy in remote parishes, children preparing for First Communion. All marked for what the document called spiritual harvesting. All scheduled to have their faith consumed by the entities Cardinal Agnelli served. At the bottom of the document, in modern blue ink, was a handwritten note: Next harvest, Christmas midnight mass, St. Peter's Basilica. Estimated yield, 8,000 souls. Christmas was 6 days away. You shouldn't have opened that. I spun around to find Cardinal Agnelli standing in the chapel doorway, no longer praying. His eyes were kind, grandfatherly, completely human, which somehow made everything worse. "Your Eminence," I managed. "I can explain." "No need, my boy. I know exactly why you're here." He stepped into the safe room, closing the door behind him. "Giovanni sent you, didn't he? Even from beyond the grave, your grandfather continues to meddle in affairs he never understood. You're feeding on people's faith, on their souls. I'm providing a service." Cardinal Agnelli's voice carried the patient tone of a teacher correcting a slow student. "Do you have any idea how many souls are lost to despair each year? How many faithful Catholics die questioning God's love? My partners offer them certainty, purpose, an eternity of service instead of an eternity of doubt, by enslaving them to supernatural entities, by giving their suffering meaning." He moved closer, and I noticed his shadow was now moving in perfect synchronization. Whatever had been controlling it was paying closer attention. "Your grandfather never grasped the theological implications. Free will is a burden, Matteo. Most people are grateful to have it lifted." I thought about the schedule in my hands. 8,000 souls during Christmas, Massachusetts families celebrating Christ's birth, children's faces lit by candlelight, elderly Catholics clutching rosaries as they received communion one final time before their faith was stripped away and fed to things that had never known salvation. "The key," I said, raising the dark metal object. "What does it really do?" Cardinal Agnelli's expression grew sad. "It completes the contract, transfers my authority over the harvesting operations to the next generation of eliminatori. Makes you my successor, with all the responsibilities that entails. And if I refuse, then the contract defaults to its original terms. Every soul that should have been harvested peacefully over the next century gets consumed violently, immediately. 8 million faithful Catholics die screaming as their faith is torn from them by force instead of guided gently into service." The key felt like a live coal in my hand. "You're saying I have to choose between becoming a monster and causing a spiritual holocaust. I'm saying you have to choose between accepting responsibility for the world as it is, or pretending your moral purity is worth more than 8 million lives." Cardinal Agnelli sat down heavily in his prayer chair, suddenly looking every one of his 87 years. "Your grandfather faced the same choice. He chose his conscience over human survival. I've spent 40 years cleaning up the consequences." The consequences? Rogue harvesting. Entities that were supposed to feed gradually and sustainably, instead gorging themselves on terror and despair. The rise in religious violence worldwide, the scandals that have driven people from the church, the growing number of souls lost to complete faithlessness. All because Giovanni Albani couldn't bear to become what the world needed him to become. I thought about Elena's research into Vatican cover-ups, the stories of miracles and curses that never made it into official records. How many of those events had been supernatural entities feeding without supervision? How many tragedies could have been prevented if Nano had completed his work? "Show me," I said. "Show me what happens if I use the key." Cardinal Agnelli nodded sadly and pressed a button on his desk. The chapel wall slid away, revealing a hidden room filled with monitors showing locations around the world. Churches, temples, synagogues, mosques, all with the same subtle wrongness I'd learned to recognize. Shadows moving independently, congregants with too bright eyes, clergy whose reflections didn't match their faces. "The network," he explained. "Every major religious institution on Earth, managed through careful partnerships with entities that understand the necessity of sustainable harvesting. Your grandfather's weapons weren't meant to destroy these beings. They were meant to establish communication protocols, binding contracts that benefit both sides." On one monitor, I watched a Christmas Eve service in what looked like St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. The congregation was singing Silent Night, their faces radiant with faith and joy. But in the shadows behind the altar, something moved with too many angles, and I realized it wasn't sharing their joy. It was preparing to consume it. "How long?" I whispered. "The modern system has been in place since 1823. Before that, the harvesting was less organized, more wasteful. Entire communities would lose their faith overnight, leaving spiritual wastelands that took centuries to recover." Cardinal Agnelli gestured to another monitor, showing a mosque in Istanbul, where the faithful were gathering for morning prayers while shadows with wings circled overhead. "We learned to be more efficient, more humane. Humane. The faithful die peacefully, still believing they're going to heaven. Their families mourn natural deaths instead of witnessing supernatural horror. The entities receive nourishment without causing panic or spiritual collapse. Everyone benefits, except the people being harvested, who are going to die anyway. Cardinal Agnelli's voice carried the weight of decades of rationalization. Cancer, accidents, old age, death comes for everyone, Matteo. We simply ensure their faith serves a purpose instead of dying with them. I stared at the monitors, watching congregations around the world prepare for Christmas celebrations that would be their last. 8,000 at St. Peter's alone, millions more at services worldwide, all scheduled to have their souls consumed by entities that had learned to wear human faces and speak with human voices. All because someone like me generations ago had decided that managing monsters was preferable to fighting them. What was my great-great-grandfather's name? I asked suddenly. Cardinal Agnelli looked surprised by the question. Lorenzo Albani. He was the first Illuminator, appointed by Pope Leo XII in 1823. Why? And before him? How did the Church handle supernatural threats? Badly. Exorcisms that failed more often than they succeeded. Holy wars that accomplished nothing except spreading terror. Inquisitions that burned more innocent people than actual supernatural entities. Cardinal Agnelli leaned forward earnestly. The Illuminator system works, Matteo. It's kept the balance for 2 centuries. What balance? I was thinking about something Father Orsini had said about the Church surviving for 2 millennia before the Illuminator division existed. What was different before 1823? The entities were less organized, more primitive. They fed randomly, chaotically, leaving obvious evidence of supernatural activity. Cardinal Agnelli's expression grew troubled. The modern system makes them more efficient, but it also makes them smarter. More collaborative. You mean it's made them stronger? A long pause. Yes. I looked at the key in my hand, understanding the final trap. Using it wouldn't just make me Cardinal Agnelli's successor. It would upgrade the supernatural entity's harvesting capabilities. Each generation of Illuminatori had expanded the network, refined the feeding schedules, made the whole system more efficient, and more dependent on human cooperation. What happens if I destroy the key instead of using it? Cardinal Agnelli went very still. The contract reverts to its original terms. No human oversight, no sustainability protocols, no protection for the faithful. The entities would be free to feed however they chose. Or they'd have to find a new way to survive. Matteo, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. I stood up, the key burning in my hand like a brand. This whole system exists because my family has been feeding supernatural parasites for 2 centuries. Teaching them to be more efficient predators, helping them evolve. It exists because it's the only way to prevent spiritual catastrophe. It exists because my great-great-grandfather was too afraid to let the Church face its enemies honestly. I thought about all the faithful Catholics who died peacefully in their beds over the past 2 centuries, never knowing their final moments of prayer were feeding things that treated human souls like livestock. How many people have died to maintain this balance? Cardinal Agnelli's face crumpled. Millions. But Matteo, if you break the system now, then millions more will die violently instead of peacefully. I understand the choice. I walked to the monitors, watching congregations prepare for Christmas services that would either be their salvation or their doom, depending on what I did in the next few minutes. But you're wrong about one thing. What? Those aren't the only 2 options. I pulled out my phone and speed dialed Elena's number. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. Matteo? Did you find the safe? I found everything. Elena, I need you to contact every investigative journalist you know. Every Vatican correspondent, every religious studies scholar with a platform, every blogger who covers church scandals. I was looking at the monitors, memorizing addresses, calculating time zones. I'm going to send you photographs of documents that will destroy the Catholic Church's credibility for generations. But they'll also save 8 million lives. Matteo, what are you talking about? I'm talking about breaking the system entirely. No more secret deals with supernatural entities. No more managed harvesting. No more families cursed to serve as intermediaries between the Church and things that shouldn't exist. I started photographing the contract, the feeding schedules, the monitor displays showing compromised religious sites worldwide. I'm talking about letting humanity face its supernatural enemies with honesty instead of comfortable lies. Cardinal Agnelli was on his feet now, his shadow writhing independently against the chapel wall. You'll cause a global faith crisis. People will stop believing in God entirely. Maybe. Or maybe they'll start believing in a God who doesn't require human sacrifice to maintain the cosmic balance. I sent the first batch of photos to Elena. Maybe they'll realize that 2,000 years of Christianity survived without supernatural management, and it can survive the truth. The entities won't simply disappear because you've exposed them. No, but they'll have to find a new feeding strategy, one that doesn't depend on human cooperation and institutional cover-ups. I thought about all the supernatural horror stories I'd read growing up, where monsters lived in shadows and fed on fear because they couldn't operate openly. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe humanity is stronger when it knows what it's fighting. I raised the key, not toward the lock that would transfer the contract to me, but toward the monitors that showed the supernatural network's control systems. "Matteo, stop!" Cardinal Agnelli lunged toward me, but his movement was too fast, too fluid. His human mask was slipping, revealing something underneath with too many teeth. "The contract is binding. You cannot simply." I drove the key into the main monitor with all my strength. Sparks flew, and the display went dark. Then another monitor, then another. "The key isn't just for transferring contracts," I said, understanding flooding through me as I destroyed each display. "It's for unlocking the whole system, breaking every binding at once." Cardinal Agnelli's scream wasn't entirely human. Around the world, I imagined other screams. Entities suddenly cut off from their carefully managed food supply. Supernatural beings who'd grown dependent on institutional partnerships finding themselves alone again in a world that no longer offered them protection. The last monitor went dark. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat and something else. A sound like vast wings unfolding, like ancient chains breaking, like the first breath of something that had been sleeping for centuries. "What have you done?" Cardinal Agnelli whispered. His face was human again, but his eyes held the terror of someone who'd just lost everything he'd spent decades building. "I've given humanity back its war," I said. "No more management, no more sustainable harvesting, no more lies about divine balance requiring human sacrifice." I looked at the broken monitors, each one representing thousands of supernatural entities suddenly cut loose from their Vatican contracts. It's going to be chaos. People are going to die, but they'll die fighting instead of being farmed. My phone was buzzing with notifications, Elena forwarding the documents to news outlets worldwide, religious scholars demanding verification, Vatican correspondents scrambling to confirm the most explosive leak in church history. "You've doomed us all," Cardinal Agnelli said, but his voice carried a note of something that might have been relief. "The entities will feed chaotically now, without restraint, without mercy. Then we'll learn to fight them without institutional protection." I thought about Nano's weapons, still hidden in his apartment, blessed silver that could wound supernatural entities, holy water that could reveal their true forms, centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to survive in a world where monsters existed. Maybe that's what faith was supposed to be, not comfortable certainty, but courage in the face of genuine mystery. The chapel door burst open and Swiss guards poured in, but these were human guards, not the entity that had worn Captain Farnese's face. Their leader, a young sergeant whose nameplate read Mueller, took in the scene with professional efficiency. "Your Eminence, we received reports of an intruder." He stopped, staring at the destroyed monitors and scattered documents. "Sir, what happened here?" Cardinal Agnelli looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something like respect in his ancient eyes. "Sergeant Mueller, Dr. Albany was helping me with some technical difficulties. The situation is resolved. Sir, please escort Dr. Albany from Vatican grounds. His research access is hereby revoked." Cardinal Agnelli sat down heavily in his prayer chair, suddenly looking fragile and human. "And Sergeant, increase security around all Vatican facilities. I suspect we're going to have some unusual visitors in the coming days." As the guards led me away, I heard Cardinal Agnelli begin to pray. Not the formal liturgy of the hours, but something that sounded like a man asking forgiveness for decades of choices that had seemed right at the time. Outside, Rome was waking up to a world where monsters were no longer managed by institutional partnerships. News alerts were already appearing on phones and computers. Leaked documents suggesting Vatican involvement in global supernatural phenomena. Religious scholars demanding investigations. Atheist bloggers claiming vindication, while believers struggled to process implications that challenged everything they thought they knew about faith. Elena was waiting for me at the Vatican gates, her face bright with excitement and terror. "Matteo, the story is everywhere. Every major news outlet wants interviews. The Vatican press office is in complete chaos. But there are also reports of strange incidents worldwide. Churches evacuated due to unusual phenomena. Religious gatherings disrupted by technical malfunctions. It's starting, I said, thinking about supernatural entities suddenly cut off from their carefully regulated food supply, forced to improvise new feeding strategies. The real war. The one my family has been preventing for 2 centuries. Are you sure this was the right choice? I thought about the monitors showing Christmas congregations who would now have a chance to celebrate Christ's birth without having their souls harvested. I thought about the families who would face supernatural threats honestly instead of being managed by institutional lies. I thought about the children who would grow up in a world where faith meant courage instead of compliance. Ask me in a century, I said, when we know whether humanity was strong enough to handle the truth. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The old contracts are broken, Giovanni's grandson. But new ones can always be written. We know where you live. We know what you've done. We know what you cost us. The grateful management. I deleted the message and put my arm around Elena's shoulders. Around us, Rome continued its ancient rhythm. Tourists snapping photos, street vendors hawking souvenirs, pilgrims queuing for St. Peter's Basilica. But now they were doing it in a world where the monsters were no longer hidden, where the war between human and supernatural was no longer managed by secret contracts, where faith would have to mean something more than comfortable surrender to institutional authority. It was going to be chaos. It was going to be beautiful. In my pocket, the broken key had gone cold and lifeless, its power spent. But in Nano's apartment, his weapons waited, blessed silver and holy water, and 2 centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to survive in a world where monsters existed. The Albany family's war wasn't ending. It was finally beginning honestly. And for the first time since I'd inherited Nano's burden, that felt like freedom. The real kind. The kind that came with consequences and courage and the terrible, beautiful weight of choosing truth over comfort. Libertas. The sun was rising over Rome, and somewhere in the growing light, humanity was waking up to a world where faith would have to mean something more than managed surrender. I thought Giovanni would have been proud. Final entry in the Journal of Matteo Albani, former Vatican researcher, current monster hunter. Written Christmas morning, 2024, while monitoring supernatural incident reports from around the world. The war is different now. Harder. More honest. It's exactly what the world needed.